We outside government believe that the purpose of government is to facilitate opportunities for joint gains, opportunities for states to come together and solve problems that exist when individuals don't cooperate and when states and communities compete against each other. Therefore, this House would prohibit provincial and local governments from offering tax incentives to lure corporations to open businesses in their domains. What we mean by this is that tax policy for corporations would largely be set at the national level. We're also okay with other kinds of regulations being set at the national level so we don't have competition on those grounds, things like environmental policy, etc. 3 constructive points I want to give to you today. First, I want to talk about incentives to undercut on policy and the prisoner's dilemma that exists in the status quo. Second, I want to talk about equality of treatment for communities. And third, I want to talk about long-term efficiency of where corporations ought to be located. So first, incentives to undercut and the prisoner's dilemma. What's the optimal outcome when we consider everybody's interests together? When the optimal outcome is that you both have businesses in your communities, but also that you get significant tax revenue. Tax revenue helps you provide services to your citizens, etc. So you want to maximize these joint gains of both revenue and businesses, jobs, all of those things together. But your ability to compete on tax policy creates an incentive to defect, to lower your tax policy to try and attract new businesses to your area. So say New York might drop its taxes to try and get businesses located in New Jersey to slide on over the border. What does this happen? What does this mean? What happens? We reduce the joint gains that might otherwise exist because now tax revenue is lower, but we've only moved the businesses around. We haven't necessarily created more of them. So we've minimized the gains that could be achieved through cooperation, and we think that's particularly harmful because I want to link this idea of minimizing joint gains on their side of the house to the very purpose of government. What does government do? We think what government's purpose is, like broadly speaking, if we look back to Hobbes, etc., is to take us out of the state of anarchy where it's difficult to cooperate, where there are opportunities for people to work together and we often don't do so. Things like, say, providing public goods like police forces, the military, or post offices. All of those are examples where cooperation is difficult without national regulation. But on our side of the house, we recognize that this problem also extends to tax policy when we allow it to occur regionally. We preserve the purpose of government, so we're not like stepping on the sovereignty of these communities by making every community better off through national regulation. Because every community ultimately gets higher tax revenue and more businesses when we don't have this competition that exists on their side of the house.
How do you magically make it so that the federal government is choosing some optimal tax rate as opposed to the reality in which they try to maximize it, often in some cases far too high, and end up hurting business in that way?
So I'm not sure why you think like corporate tax policy would be far too high, right? I thought you were going to really like capture it, it'll be far too low. But I don't think that the federal government would set tax policies that are worse than the states, right? It's certainly not going to be optimal. Like I'm not saying they have the perfect bureaucrat designing tax policy. At the same time, they don't have this large incentive to defect or compete against one another. Yeah. So while they might certainly have some biases, be some lobbying, right? All of those problems also exist in state legislatures, but at least they're not competing against other people to nearly the same degree as you are when states and communities are competing against each other. So the problems are smaller, but not non-existent on our side of the house. The second thing I want to talk about, though, is equality of treatment. Because what happens to different communities and where do businesses locate when they're allowed to compete? We think that if you can offer benefits to communities, what does getting a business in your community actually end up depending on? It depends on how well I can offer incentives. So what does that mean? It means that wealthier communities will generally get more businesses. Because if I have a higher base of individuals with, say, like individuals with high private incomes, then I can rely on taxation of them to fund my governmental services rather than taxation of businesses. So communities that already don't necessarily need that job creation are now the ones that are best able to attract businesses on their side of the house. We also think that historically successful communities are those that will most likely to attract businesses. So communities that have large, say, surpluses in the past might require lower taxes and can attract even more businesses in the future, rather than communities that might need new revenue. We also think that resource-endowed communities or other areas might get more revenue. So if I'm, say, a province in Canada with lots of oil revenue, we can rely on that instead. Then I might be able to kind of fund myself that way and attract other kinds of businesses by effectively cross-subsidizing them with my oil revenue. I don't need to tax them because I can get my revenue in other places. All of this means that communities that are already advantaged on their side of the house get even more businesses under their policy, whereas communities that actually need the allocation of these resources don't get them. I'll take closing if you have a question at any point.
What is your opinion of the state or provinces making decisions about, say, health policy or environmental policy, everything like that? Do you take away that right for provinces to make that decision?
So we think certain policies where there are like large incentives to defect that could have like terrible problems should be regulated at national level. So I give the inventor of environmental regulation. I think like because of the externalities associated with pollution, similar to the externalities associated with undercutting someone on tax policy, we do want to regulate. I'm not sure the same kinds of large externalities exist with things like healthcare. So you have to draw it case by case. but I do think sometimes, yes, things need to be decided at the national level for joint gains, just like we do when we have a national military, because it's the only way to get those joint gains. Finally, though, I want to talk about long-term efficiency. So what should our goal be as a society? We think one of our goals should be to maximize the wealth that we create. It's not just because we really like money and money is great, but rather because when we maximize the wealth of our society, we improve everybody's ability to pursue the good life however they construe it, right? Like if I have more money, I can do more things that I might like to do. In general, I'm better off, I'm a happier person. So why do we maximize wealth on our side of the house? We think that where businesses locate is now determined by the actual underlying resources that make them most productive. Things like, well, do I have better human capital in this area that make my business more efficient rather than better tax policy? Am I located closer to a harbor that might make me more productive when that's not balanced against something like a tax incentive? So in the long term, these businesses are more productive because they choose to locate in areas where they have maximally productive resources rather than in areas with artificially created incentives like some kind of tax. And what does that larger benefit mean? We think it means more income for many of these communities, right, in the long term, because if businesses produce more in tax at the national level, I get more tax revenue. But we also think it means that individuals are likely to be more generous in their allocation of income. So if I want to help out these poor communities that might not have that same level of human capital, and I've created more wealth on our side of the house, we think people are more likely to support the kind of redistributionist policies that would be good for those communities, more likely to say give or develop in poor communities, when the general level of wealth, the general level of welfare is higher on our side of the house because businesses have located where it's most productive and they ultimately produce more. So because of this incentive to defect and the prisoner's dilemma that exists on our side of the house, because corporations ultimately undermine joint gains when communities compete on tax policy, and that's the very purpose of government, because we want equality of treatment for these communities, and because long-term efficiency is ultimately an important goal for our society in terms of allowing individuals to pursue the good life as they construe it, we're very happy to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for his speech, and now look to the first speaker of the opposition to open the case, Paul Christine.
Madam Speaker, I think the problem with what we just heard out of opening government is that they assume that the federal government will always make these policies perfectly, but local and state governments would always get it wrong. We think not only does this make no theoretical sense, but empirically this just isn't the case. That is, places like Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, or parts of Connecticut that have special tax incentives to incentivize financial firms to locate there, are all places that empirically prove that these types of policies can work, that they don't result in inefficient outcomes, and that they do raise aggregate levels of welfare. So what am I going to bring to this? I want to talk about two things primarily. First, why we believe this is a necessary and justified local government action, and particularly why we believe local governments are especially well equipped to make these types of decisions. And second of all, I want to make a number of arguments about why we think on our side of the house, allowing these types of corporate tax havens raises aggregate welfare and makes people better off. But before I do that, I want to talk about the arguments that we heard out of NAP. So the first thing that opening government tells us is that essentially this is a prisoner's dilemma, that essentially now everyone's going to end up lowering their taxes and everyone's going to be worse off. So first of all, Matt clearly doesn't know very much about the prisoner's dilemma because that assumes that you can't communicate with each other. But of course this isn't true in this case. Local governments and state governments can talk to each other and coordinate coordinate their tax policies just as the way they've done empirically. This is why, for example, that so many pharmaceutical companies are located in New Jersey, but so many financial companies are located in Connecticut. Not true empirically. But we also think when Matt tells us that, look, all the communities are going to get more revenue on their side of the house, that's not true.
Sir.
Why? Because some communities don't have any businesses located there right now. There are structural inequalities that exist that allow some communities that have harbors and the natural resources that Matt talks about as being so efficient to garner more revenue in that way, but that harm communities that lack any of these natural resources. But then there are certain types of businesses that don't require any of these resources. For example, we would say, and I'll take back in a second, that you don't need to have any natural resources to be an efficient place to locate a corporate headquarters. So for those communities that have no natural resources or any inherent advantages, this gives them their only avenue to any revenue. Sure.
Your argument would work if it hasn't been proven that Delaware is the only state that benefits on aggregate as a result of being able to control its own state policy on taxes, because it's the only one to which
so
all
does North
corporations.
Carolina, so does New Jersey, and so does Connecticut. You just don't know what you're talking about. The second thing, though, is that they talk about equality of treatment. They say now wealthier communities are going to get more of the money. So the problem is that that's only true if cities are setting this policy. But suppose a state is setting this policy and saying we have wealthy communities in some places and poorer communities in other places. A state can decide to lower their tax policies in certain areas of the state which solve these types of problems. Again, they just assume this would happen in the worst way possible. But of course, empirically, that's not the case. We also think, though, that states can, say, sacrifice revenue for a couple of years in the hopes of long-term gains, exactly as they've done in poor parts of the United States and the Southeast. Finally, they talk about long-term efficiencies, and they say, look, companies are going to make bad decisions. One, I don't think companies are suddenly going to start making bad decisions and locate in places that make no sense for them. We think more likely is the case that companies that don't need any particular natural resource and where no place is particularly efficient are going to decide to locate themselves in places where there were no other businesses before, creating the only jobs and the only economic successes in these regions. No thank you. So, I want to move now to my constructive material. First, we want to talk about why we think this is a necessary and justified local government action. We think, Madam Speaker, that the federal government is particularly ill-equipped to make these types of determinations. We think that problems like structural unemployment on the local level or lack of local level infrastructure are not problems that A, federal governments are often aware of because they don't have people paying attention to them, and B, are not particularly keen to deal with because they're at the very bottom of their priority list. These are local problems that national governments never prioritize. The only time they do is when lobbyists tell them to. But of course, those lobbyists already come from the wealthy communities that can afford them, creating the types of wealth disparities that we heard about from opening government. We think this is exactly what local and state governments are for. They're more aware of these problems, that they have localized information about what communities need, which communities would be particularly amenable to having corporate tax havens located there, and as a result can make better decisions than the federal government ever would. This is why, for example, school-to-schooling decisions that are made on a local level are systematically better than those made at the federal level, because local communities know what they need better and do a better job. Sure, Matt.
So New Jersey, New York, Delaware, and the Research Triangle are some of the wealthiest areas in the United States. Where is the evidence that these poor communities will actually offer the incentives that you talk about?
So the areas right next to Research Triangle Park, like Hillsborough and Pittsburgh, are some of the poorest areas in North Carolina. They weren't wealthy before Research Triangle Park opened there. That's the point. On our side of the house, we create welfare, which brings me to the second argument I want to talk about, which is the numerous ways that this policy increases aggregate welfare. First of all, we think, obviously, this brings in jobs. We think for places that don't have a harbor to bring them shipping companies, that there are not likely to be businesses there, that there are communities that are incredibly poor, suffer from structural unemployment, that need to be able to create some type of comparative advantage for themselves because they won't have any otherwise. So we have more jobs on our side of the house in these communities. But we also think, Madam Speaker, that it's particularly important that this isn't zero sum within an individual country. We think the fact that on their side of the house they ban this type of policy in one country means that these companies are just going to move to other places. Or by that on our side of the house, by allowing states to make these type of decisions, they bring more companies in from other places. That's why, for example, Luxembourg has had so much success in recent years by using this exact type of policy. We say countries should be responsible to their people at the local level and bring in foreign businesses to make more jobs and make everyone better off. That's why this type of zero-sum mentality that they talk about on their side of the house doesn't actually materialize. We also think, though, on their side of the house, that when you bring large corporations into poor areas, guess what? Wealthy people come with those corporations. So when wealthy corporate managers move to poor parts of the rural Southeast in the United States, guess what? The tax base in those communities becomes larger. So now there are more income taxes being collected to offset losses in corporate taxes, which again means that these communities can afford more welfare and more programs to help those who are disadvantaged. But we also think, as we already talked about, that on our side of the house, we allow local governments and state governments to use these types of policies to solve for the natural disparities that exist in comparative advantage. Some communities that have agricultural endowments or mining endowments are better able to attract businesses, which of course creates the types of outcomes that Matt calls efficient and I would call unequal. That some communities have no jobs, and so this allows them to create comparative advantage out of nothing. But what's really important, though, is that on our side of the house, we allow communities not just to create a comparative advantage in having low taxes across the board, but to specialize in certain industries. So, for example, as I talked about, different states in the United States lower tax rates for certain different industries, creating A, cross-state coordination, so you don't have the zero-sum problems and across-the-board lower tax rates that Matt talks about, but that B, certain places can become more efficient by specializing in a certain industry, allowing these corporations to benefit from economies of scale, to expand at a rapid rate, to lower their costs, and as a result, hire more people and increase aggregate welfare. Look, we think on their side of the house, they give you an incredibly misguided view of how this would work out. It's worked empirically, and it's going to continue to work on our side. We're incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker very much for his speech, and now look to the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the case for the opening government scheme.
Great, thank you, Madam Speaker. In this speech, I'm going to bring you a new constructive point about the political funding incentives at the local level and how they're much worse than at the national level, where side op wants to, or where side gov wants to regulate. But first, I want to talk to you about Matt's points, because Josh makes what I think are a number of misguided points in response to our constructive material. So he tells you that there's not a prisoner's dilemma that exists, because these states will coordinate and talk to each other, right? I think, like, empirically, this is actually not true, right? The states actually, as a local legislator, have every incentive not to coordinate, to undercut, and to get the best deals for their own people. But even when you talk to each other, there's an incredible incentive to defect, right? If I see jobs falling in my local community and want to defect, which screws over my state long term, but will help me get elected in the short term, that's incredibly problematic, and communication doesn't solve that issue. But we also tell you that particularly within the United States, but also abroad, different states have different amounts of political power, right? So the states with the most political power and the most resources will always be the ones, even if they're communicating with each other, to not have to undercut. We think that's problematic. Then Josh tells you that there are structural inequalities in the states. So the corporations will always move to the places with, like, the best structure, for example, the harbor. They make it worse on their side of the house, because they allow the corporations with the most resources, the places that are best off because they have oil or because they have a harbor like Boston, to actually undercut their tax rates and have more corporations move over, because they can already take care of basic public goods like schools. They actually list the wealthiest states, as Matt points out in his POI, and we think that's incredibly problematic for them, because what they point out to you in their own speech is these wealthy states, the people who are already best off, are the only ones who have the ability to undercut and therefore attract more wealth in the future. We solve this problem on our side of the house with federal level regulation. The last thing they talk to you about is they think the companies that have the natural resources will always locate in these regions. So we tell you, yeah, sure, possibly that's true if I'm a company that needs, like, a certain amount of wind for my wind turbines. But we tell you that there are other incentives that companies look at when locating. Things like cheap labor or best human capital, right? The best educated populations. Further, they look at location for transportation costs. All of these things can be outweighed by the tax undercuts on their side of the house, which hurts long-term efficiency, because it means companies aren't looking to locate where they'll be most productive in the long term. They're looking to locate where they can get the best taxes now. We think that's problematic for the future wealth of our nation. All right, let's move on. Sure, Josh.
So you tell us that it will be a problem because they won't coordinate, and that will lead all of them to be worse off. But if everyone knows that, why won't they talk to each other and coordinate so it doesn't happen?
So I think that what we're talking about is long-term wealth, right? Local legislators have every incentive just to look better for the next election cycle or the next 2 election cycles, and not actually to maximize the long-term economic efficiency of their state, right? That's what the political incentives are. Further, we tell you, like, communication doesn't always solve this coordination problem, particularly when there are differences in political power. Moving on to rebuttal. So Josh gives you this point about how he thinks it's good for local governments to make these decisions, and he gives you the examples of schools, right? So first of all, we think local congressmen always have an incentive. If they have an incentive to get jobs, they will press at the national level for better tax rates if they think that it is overall hurting their prospects of jobs or unemployment in their state. But further, we tell you that we think there are all kinds of lobbying issues, which I'm going to talk about in my speech, which are worse. Finally, we tell you that federal elections care incredibly about the optimum corporate tax level, things like the economy and unemployment, which we just saw in the most recent election in the United States. They have to get up and give you a reason why optimum tax levels would be different in, say, New Jersey or New York. We tell you they're not different, they're basically the same on the federal level, and it's incredibly problematic that they give you no reason why states wouldn't undercut. Then they talk to you about structural unemployment, and they tell you we need to set out, like, an advantage in order to solve these issues. We tell you the places with structural unemployment are exactly the places that cannot possibly undercut with their tax rates, right? That's a point for our side of the house. The companies are not going to locate here because the places with structural unemployment are the people who absolutely need these tax rates to, for example, keep their public schools running. Then they give you this interesting point about how they think they're, like, international harms, right? There's international competition on both sides. They make it uniquely bad when they give incentives for individual provinces or states to undercut in the status quo. Further, like we think big states like the United States has international negotiating power that helps to mitigate some of these issues. Sure.
You talk about unequal power between the states, but doesn't that mean that the federal government will then only incentivize the industries of those more powerful
Here,
states?
here.
Right. So we think that that exists literally on both sides of the house, right? But we also think that it is particularly problematic then when you give states an individual mechanism, right? Particularly giving, say, the United States election policies, they have to get the support of all of the states, right? It's important to win small, non-politically powerful states, particularly with things like the Electoral College. The last thing they talked to you about is specialization. We tell you that there will be specialization on both sides of the house, right? Companies will cluster if they actually get benefits from clustering. We think they make it worse because they offer benefits that aren't actually long-term economic efficiencies that you get from clustering. They're just temporary tax benefits that skew these companies' decisions. Let's move on to my constructive material, because I want to talk to you about political funding. When political candidates have direct influence over their corporate tax rates, corporations have every incentive to lobby these politicians and to fund their campaigns in a way that will decrease their tax burden or increase their tax shelter. Why is this particularly problematic on the provincial level versus the national level? Well, we think on the provincial level, there's often less media and less scrutiny, where people can actually check what kinds of donations these politicians are getting. It's harder for the public to check the legislator, particularly in an age where local newspapers are losing power and funding, and really only the strong national bands that pick up huge stories about the national legislator are getting any attention. We also think that it's financially easier for local corporations, the kinds of corporations that really need these tax shelters and have every incentive to get them, to pay for a local legislative election rather than national. It's simply cheaper, they can support more candidates. We also think that ultimately, these corporations or corporate friends are more valuable for these politicians. They might have more difficulty getting jobs, after their tenure, right? They're not a state legislator, they're not a national legislator, they're a local legislator. It is a smaller fish pond, which means that corporations ultimately get less power and there's less scrutiny over these corporations' power. This means that local legislators are always making a decision based on what's personally best for them in a uniquely bad way versus on the national legislator. This is incredibly problematic because even if they could deal with these undercutting issues that side op thinks they could, they would never be looking for the socially optimal tax rate. They would be looking for their personal optimal tax rate in order to get funding from these national corporations. We're not doing that.
I thank the speaker very much for her speech, and now I'll across to the second speaker from opening opposition to conclude the first half of this debate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The government in this round seems to exist in a world in which state and local governments are these evil little systems that are all trying to plot against one another. But the federal government is this wonderful, generous entity that is looking to help out everyone at all times and is not subject to things like money in politics or lobbying or anything else that would disadvantage certain groups over other groups. So I want to bring this debate a little bit back to reality and explain the ways in which, in fact, this policy allows states to coordinate and calibrate their taxation decisions to maximally help not only their own individuals, which they have a right to do, as Josh discussed in great detail and wasn't sufficiently engaged with, but also increases aggregate wealth in general. But before we get to that, let's deal with some of the arguments we again hear from the government in this case. The first argument is, again, this rearticulation of the prisoner's dilemma. And as Josh explains, well, the issue is you absolutely have the ability to talk and coordinate so you don't get any of the kinds of prisoner dilemmas problems that you normally have. Their only answer to this is, well, hey, you have people who are exclusively interested in the short term. That's simply not true, because you have people who are interested in getting reelected year after year in lots of different circumstances, which means they're obligated to look forward at least 5, 10, 15 years out when it comes to those kinds of policies. You also have citizens who are not stupid and who are not willing to say if it in fact is detrimental for those individuals that they're going to be hurt in these massive numbers of cases. And you have plenty of interest of those people who are doing pretty well off or successfully, who are trying to maximize sort of efficiency of the government in those cases. So the prisoner's dilemma simply doesn't hold in that kind of circumstance. Then they move on to this discussion that says, well, there are historically advantaged communities and those are the ones who are conceded and it's only going to aggregate over the wealthy. But this argument simply doesn't make sense. First, if you actually do this on a state level, you can allow states to help themselves out by going after the individual state and local communities that are the ones that are the worst off in the current status quo, and allow us to reverse that cycle because you can allocate in those ways. Second, if you don't allow this kind of system, you're never going to reverse the cycle in the first place. That is to say that there are some states that just have larger endowments that are better off from natural resource perspectives, that are more successful, and you're never going to change that. So when they say, well, look, it's not productive because there are some people that have better education or some things like that, and it's not efficient. Yes, why do they have better education? Because they have more resources in the status quo, because they've never been able to catch up to all of the other states. The only way to actually make sure that all states are able to maximize the benefits that they get is to ensure that those states that are behind have a means of catching up, and this is the fundamental way to reverse the cycle. Why does this make a lot of sense, for example? Because if you're a place like North Carolina and you focus on one individual industry, your decision is not going to be to say, hey, I'm going to incentivize some other new industry to join because you're doing very well, your citizens are quite happy, and you're relatively wealthy. So you don't have an incentive to go overboard when it comes to those things. On the other hand, you have other states and local governments that say, look, this is working for other people in other places. I'm going to look to implement it based on a different industry or a different location to appeal to a different party, and then aggregate all the wealth that you can benefit from in that individual case. Yeah, Matt?
You tell us there's a prisoner's dilemma that people will be able to coordinate to avoid. Let's just assume that's the case for a second.
Right.
And you also tell us it's great for people to actually drop their taxes because of all of the welfare maximization you get on your side of the house. So which is it? We're coordinating to avoid a prisoner's dilemma, or we're actually going to drop it and achieve joint gains?
Both, right? So we coordinate with regard to different industries in different places based on what's geographically useful in one place or another. You coordinate to make sure that both are not doing it at the same time. If you want to play the prisoner's dilemma game, then fine, it's a repeated game in which you know you're going to be working with a person in the future, which means that in fact you decide to not do it now because you recognize that you're going to get some benefit from the other person in the computer. We don't need to decide which one is the Nash equilibrium. That seems beside the point of the individual round. So in fact, if you want to reverse the cycle in any individual case, the best way to do it is to allow these benefits. Because not only do you benefit the individual community, but you get massive spillover effects. That is to say that areas like North Carolina have certain very concentrated wealthy areas that then allow them to provide resources to the other areas around them, which make them far, far wealthier. And so this picture that says this only happens for wealthy states is absurd. I know Josh likes North Carolina because he's from there, but in general, it's not a particularly wealthy state, and one of the only redeeming things about his mediocre state is the fact that they've been able to generate massive wealth based on this good economic policy and then help people out over the last 20 to 30 years. So that doesn't make sense. They say, hey, this is a means of you're just going to go after individual places with natural resources and harbors. Except that those places are always going to have a comparative advantage when it comes to those individual industries. The thing you should do is try to incentivize businesses that don't rely on those individual structural things like the harbor in that one place to go to someplace else and make sure that they set up shop in that place so that you maximize the success of businesses in general. It just makes sense as an economic approach. So why is this a good idea? Because it allows states to coordinate and calibrate. We talked about the idea of coordination already fundamentally throughout the round. That is to say that their states are allowed to have discussions with one another. They have different endowments and different resources, which means they're beneficial. They're better off in some industries than they are in other industries, just based on what they've historically done or based on what is left between them, which means they can make decisions in between themselves. But secondly, and sometimes even more importantly, is it allows them to calibrate so that they can actually decide the right tax policy for their own individual state. That is to say that there are different reasons why certain states would be better off and certain states would be worse off going after certain industries, and the state and local government can focus on those things because it's far more aware of it. If you have to set policy on a federal level and you have to decide the same tax rates for everyone, you don't allow for the actual good incentives in places that it might be useful. Yeah.
Let's say we have two states that are trying to attract manufacturing to their specific state. On what planet do these states have incentives to help out these other places when they are actually in an adversarial relationship trying to attract the same type of business?
Okay, so there are, by the way, lots of different kinds of manufacturing, so you can provide incentives for different kinds. Second, if we allow ourselves to lower aggregate rates overall, we can attract business from foreign governments. The only response we got is the United States is powerful and they negotiate. I have no idea how Claire's answer on this has anything to do with Josh's argument that says we bring people in from abroad. So the idea that says that state and local governments are this terrible system and federal governments are brilliant at determining this is absurd. Federal governments have massive amounts of pork barrel, have massive amounts of lobbying. Why is that true? One, there's far more money to be made on the federal level when it comes to that. Two, it's far easier to get individual exceptions put into federal laws in lots of ways to get your own tax exemptions, which means that we don't have a system of flat rate on the federal level and then we're dealing with individual decisions down below. If that were true, then arguably this would be a good idea. But the federal tax rates right now are incredibly unfair for certain industries and not for others because they include massive subsidies for for certain industries that are decided based on special interests and not actually decided based on what is economically optimal. So what do we allow states to do? We allow them to offset that process so they can realize, for example, if the federal government is unfairly providing an incentive for one industry, that they can give themselves again a comparative advantage and have a fighting chance because they get rid of all that lobbying. The idea that says like no one reports on state and local governments is absurd. But it is true that people focus massive amounts of more money on individual federal government decisions, which means you have huge inequity in the federal tax code that you can actually solve on a state and local level, which allows you to calibrate in individual cases and make sure that states are doing something because they have the knowledge and the interest for their own individual people as opposed to a federal and very, very negative.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and now it's the first speaker from the opposing government to open the case for the second half.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My partner just brought up a very important POI that was inadequately answered in two different ways by side opposition. Right? So Brent asks, if two states focus on manufacturing, what incentive do they have to cooperate in the way that you, living in your utopia, think that they will? And the first response he gives us is that they might have different types of manufacturing. Then why can't the federal government just have different incentives for different kinds of manufacturing, which is what they do, right? Like that's actually what happens in most states that don't have provincial and local governments have control over this. So the second response he gives to this is that we'll attract foreign investment. But as I'm going to bring up in my first point of extension today, that's actually easier when you have a comprehensive tax code for your entire country, as opposed to having to jurisdiction shop within that country for different lawyers and to continually have to keep updated on which jurisdiction within that stupid country you're going to have to locate in the next time, right? That is the continual frustration of corporations. That's why most places around the world try to have very standardized tax codes so that their companies don't have to constantly worry about restructuring and lawyer fees in order to try and figure out what is actually going to be the optimal system for them. Let's just take a look at what side opposition has brought to you today. First, the national governments don't care about local issues. That's just not really true, right? Like national governments are accountable to the local populations that elected them, and as a result are actually more accountable for making the country as a whole more successful, which we think is the job of the federal government, right? We think that the federal government should be preventing the kinds of tragedies of the commons that side first proposition has already detailed to you. And we don't think we see a sufficient response from side opposition that actually convinces us that national governments are just completely going to sideline some local governments, particularly if it is true that different areas of the country have different comparative advantages in different areas, and so the federal government can just have a comprehensive tax code that incentivizes all of these, right? Like that's perfectly something within their purview. Yes.
So the federal government has far more priority to deal with vis-a-vis any locality than that local government would. How, other than lobbying and money, do you get your issues to go to the top of the pile?
I was actually going to get to that. Provincial governments and state governments have lobbying too, right? Like I don't think that you get away from this lobbying issue by just relegating it to the local governments. But if your idea is that the federal government is just not going to care about them because they don't have time, right? Like that's just not true. If you look at the tax code of Canada, by the way, which doesn't delegate to provincial and local governments, and surprisingly the first half missed. If you look at the tax code of countries that actually do this at a federal level, they tend to have incentives for different parts of the country because it's actually pretty easy to be like, look, and here are the tax incentives we're giving to you, X province, and here are the tax incentives we're giving to you, Y province. You should all vote for us. And if they're actually truly different, right? If they're actually not adversarial, then that works out pretty well for both of them. If they are adversarial, then you prevent the tragedies of the commons that we have here, wherein two localities would try and compete to have lower rates on the same product, right? So we both prevent the tragedy of the commons, or if they're actually not adversarial, then we can have a good system in which you incentivize different kinds of manufacturing or different kinds of industries, and you can do that through a federal tax code and prevent the tragedies of the commons that we're talking about. They told you that this brings in jobs. It also takes away jobs from other places, right? It actually does take away jobs from other provinces. The response to this is like, look, it's not a zero-sum game. We can attract foreign investment, but you can do that equally well by having low corporate tax rates across the country, right? We just reject this premise that it's got to be at the local level in order to attract foreign investment. Again, another good example of this is Canada, right? Which steals a lot of business from the USA from having lower corporate taxes across the board without necessarily having that at the provincial or local levels because they simply don't need to, and that actually prevents a lot of interprovincial competition that they're worried about. Then they tell you that the tax incentives can be made for certain industries. I've already told you that this also works at the federal level, that you can have different tax incentives for different areas of industry or manufacturing or whatever have you that you think the country as a whole is good at, or even that specific places within that country is good at. No. He tells you that they can just talk to each other, right? But we have two responses to this. First, they're in competition, right? Like, unlike all the other examples that opposition has given you, like education and healthcare being linked to local industry, like, provinces don't have to be better at healthcare than their neighboring provinces in order to have a good healthcare system. But definitionally, if they want companies to jurisdiction shop, they have to be better than the provinces around them, and therefore take away their business, right? So it's an adversarial system. They have no incentive to talk to each other, particularly if, as Brent points out, they focus on the same types of industry, which is something that the federal government can prevent by having an overall low rate for both of them, right? But empirically, right, our second response to this is that empirically this hasn't happened in the USA. States don't talk to each other about the optimal rate of tax that they need to set. So we're telling you that both on an empirical and a principled basis, this is just not going to happen. No, you had to try. Then they tell you that the federal government, that resource havens and stuff will have a competitive advantage anyway, right? And we think that this is just like, fine, you've just answered your own question about industries, right? You're telling us that certain places are going to have advantages anyway. And so if the federal system has tax advantages for those places, you're never going to hurt them by having a comprehensive tax code. All right, I have 3 points of extension. No, first, they tell you that a comprehensive tax code or won't attract more investment to the country. We say that's not true, right? First, you have less uncertainty about local politics. Just look at Quebec. Second, there's the knowledge that you can shift internally within that country if that makes sense. And that's actually really important to corporations, right? If they know that different jurisdictions have different amounts of control over you, then that's actually really bad for the corporation. Thirdly, and most importantly, it's easier to get a lawyer on like Canadian or American law than it is to get a lawyer on Delaware law and Connecticut law and all these different areas. And that's actually something that corporations take into account because corporations or corporate tax codes are really, really complex. And so this is why most places, again, try to coordinate their tax codes. That's why most corporate tax codes around the world look really similar. Second, tax codes should and do have preferential treatment for local shareholders, right? So this is very different when you're talking about Canadian shareholders as opposed to like Albertan shareholders. Why is this? Because Canadian and American shareholders are much more likely to be invested in their local businesses, which means that they make better corporate decisions. And these people like pay Canadian and American tax. They should have some tax incentives. But this hurts that, right? Having provincial and local businesses hurts that because people are going to be like, what if this corporation is now going to shift due to jurisdiction shopping? What if this corporation is now, and on the flip side of that, corporations will be reluctant to move because now they can't jurisdiction shop anymore. I don't actually have time to get to my third point, but we should win the round on that. Thank you.
I thank the speaker very much for her speech, and now look to the first speaker from closing opposition to open the case for her team. I wasn't ambiguous about your gender, just about who was speaking.
Yeah, no, that's very good.
An exciting class.
That would be bad.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to point out that I think there's two interesting things that we just heard out of the second proposition. One, that people are adversarial, and two, that we need different, like states and local governments are adversarial, and two, that we need to have like a tax policy that responds to that adversarial nature. I think it's really harmful when we hear out of first proposition that states have unequal power, and therefore that's a problem. As soon as states have unequal power and they go to the federal level and try and push policies about tax incentives, I think they're going to have unequal power and sway over what kind of incentives exist within that nation. If you also accept, as second proposition tells you, that they're inherently adversarial, then I think they're still going to use that mechanism and system to undermine the other states and the other states' interests. I think that's problematic. For that reason alone, this side of the House loses. On our extension, we're going to tell you that there's no single policy solution to regulatory policy. Why? They're going to do other things that are more problematic, less accountable, and more harmful for the system. But first I want to do some refutation of what we heard out of the prop benches. To this idea of prisoner's dilemma, the issue, Madam Speaker, is that you know what other states are doing. So at any point in time, you can opt out, right? As soon as you say, this is no longer beneficial for me in the small rural community to incentivize Walmart to come in and move in, because this is actually huge where this happens a lot. In rural communities where you give tax incentives to large companies to come in like Walmart, as soon as the cost becomes too high, as soon as you no longer can incentivize that company to come, you can opt out because you have that information. That's the difference in the prisoner's dilemma, Madam Speaker. In that scenario, you can't ever opt out because you don't know what the other player is doing. That's why it's reasonable and fair for states to make these calculuses and these decisions. No, thank you. Then they tell you this really interesting thing about wealthy communities. I think we've dealt with this partially, but I just want to add to this. Because recognize that what you allow to happen already is that now communities that don't have anything can't compete. So small communities, Madam Speaker, aren't able to do things like invest in infrastructure that can attract those companies in other ways. Why? Because it requires an upfront cost, right? We think tax incentives are an excellent way for small communities and rural communities to incentivize companies to come and then invest, right? We think the other mechanism that they have is to put a lot of money into schools and roads and hope that there's infrastructure and that at the end of the day, they get a company. But that's really inefficient, and those small communities could still not get that corporation and those jobs. We think tax incentives are able to be accountable, that all everyone's playing in terms of understanding who's giving what incentives, but also allows small communities to play into the game without having a lot of money at the forefront that they lose, and it leads to a lot of issues in terms of their economic cycle. Quickly go.
You tell us that communities can cooperate. Does a small community in New Jersey even know that it lost business to a small community in California? If they don't, how do they cooperate?
Okay, so I don't think I necessarily need to say that they're cooperating for the system to be functional, right? I think that it's functional and that sometimes they don't cooperate, and I think that they could potentially, insofar as, I want to say that they cooperate insofar as they both understand how the system is played and how, like, everyone, insofar as we're buying into a mechanism in which you can use incentives of taxes, that's the level of cooperation, right? I don't think you necessarily, I think you're going to have adversarial relationships on both sides of the House. I think you give them a mechanism that is fairer and more visible on our side of the House. So we think that actually it's a better mechanism for small communities because they don't have to do the upfront costs that other kinds of attracting individuals into that community would take. Let me tell you about national interest. We've had no response out of the government of why that won't be a problem when it's federally mandated, right? When these incentives exist. Recognize that I think there's going to be a huge disadvantage to small communities or rural communities that want to just incentivize one Walmart to come and then all of the other communities can have all of that cars and all of those jobs that come with having a Walmart, Madam Speaker. And that leads to a lot of jobs in those communities, and I haven't heard any response from them why we shouldn't allow those communities to use that mechanism. Finally, they tell you it's an adversarial relationship. I told you this is not necessarily bad, and also it leads to specialization, because like we told you, you can opt out at any point in time. As soon as it's not worth it for your community to give those tax incentives, they can seek out other kinds of industries, Madam Speaker, or seek out other kinds of infrastructure. I'll take you quickly.
But you can have incentives for a certain type of industry that benefits one place and also for like resource extraction, right? These aren't mutually exclusive and in fact work better at the federal level because then communities don't compete when they have the same resources.
So for the only way for their policy to actually function in any way, to have any kind of solvency, it has to be across the board, right? So all you're saying is that we have this tax incentive for this company or resource extraction. That doesn't allow communities that don't have, under the status quo, already good roads or good schools or good industries to ever compete, Madam Speaker, because they don't have the resources right now to compete with an industry that already has that kind of infrastructural advantage, right? That's what we need. We need small communities and states to be able to specialize because they need to compete with one another. They need to specialize, Madam Speaker. That's the optimal situation on second opposition. She tells us that corporate tax codes are complicated and harmful. I think that that's better for the state and like the accountability mechanism insofar as we hear that it's better for it to be federal because people care more about federal things. I reject that wholeheartedly. I think when small communities talk about whether or not that Walmart comes, when they talk about what kind of taxes they're paying or kind of revenue they're losing, Madam Speaker, that's the highest level of accountability because it directly affects you. I think if you want these kinds of things to be able to be accountable, the best way to do that is to have it at a local level where the discourse can occur and it actually affects every single member. I think when it's at a federal level, you give trade-offs and people can have biases insofar as they don't care that much about a certain agricultural incentive, but they care more about a gas one, Madam Speaker. And I think that's problematic because you don't actually have the buy-in that you need at the local level on our side of the House. She said corporations are fickle. I think that there's not like a net benefit. I'll deal with this when I deal more with our constructive. Okay, what do we want to tell you in terms of extension? We say that there's no single solution to regulatory policy. So I don't think that small communities are going to start not competing with one another, right? We just think they're going to compete in other ways. They tried to model this out in first proposition. They told you like everything else will be the same, right? That's absolutely ridiculous. We think we need individual communities to respond to their interests. So we think that when they tell you we'll just regulate every environmental policy and every decision to be all the same, I don't think that functionally works. I think you're going to see communities changing what kind of incentives they have in terms of maybe not necessarily environmental policy, but things like what kind of incentives and how much pressure they put into the government in different ways, Madam Speaker. I think you're not going to have communities not competing. They're just going to be competing in quieter ways, ones that the state and the individuals in those communities can't hold them accountable for. I think that's highly problematic. We also think that second government concedes that people have different interests and that we should account for that. The best way to account for different interests is to allow those different interests to make those decisions themselves at a direct level, Madam Speaker. We heard that concession from second proposition. Finally, I want to talk about what we're talking about in terms of upfront investment, because I think that's actually what it comes down to, Madam Speaker, on second proposition, on our extension. I think that there's other ways and mechanisms, but this is the best mechanism for these individuals to compete. How? Because it allows you to not have to, and incentivize, not upfront, not do that upfront cost of like building the infrastructure or building schools or building the roads. I think it's highly important that these small communities have an incentive and a structure mechanism to do that. All we hear out of government is that there's a net loss of taxes. I don't think there's a finite amount of industry. I think when you tax incentivize a company, you in fact could have more Walmarts, Madam Speaker, because they've been incentivized to build more of them. I don't think there's a finite amount of money. I think this allows communities to respond and to specialize. For all these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
I thank the Speaker for her speech, and now for the final speaker for the government bench to conclude the case for his team and his side.
Oh, Jesus.
How are we going to handle this? Oppressive. The tyranny of the chair.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I first want to start off with poor communities and these sort of small areas that have been floating around in the debate. Because of course, like in any debate, both sides claim that they have the better solution to help these actors that are terribly overwhelmed and have no way to help themselves. But I think that a lot of stuff is missed by side opposition that actually proves why these actors are actually harmed on their side of the house that I want to deal with right away. The first and most important thing that I think that needs to be recognized in this round is that in a situation where you have, for instance, one small community that, as they say, has no infrastructure or doesn't have the ability to give certain incentives, or doesn't have the ability to, for instance, compete because of external factors, that the only way that these people can they say that the only way that these people can actually have any parity of power is by offering incentives. What I don't think they ever respond to on any speech of the bench is something that I think First Gov actually brings up, which is that richer places actually have better abilities to be able to offer incentives because they can give, for instance, more necessarily than any poor community ever could. This means that because they're in an adversarial relationship, as Bhuwana tells you, there is no incentive for them to care about these other places. Side First opposition would like to have you believe that these people are going to have joint interests where they care about these other places. But insofar as you are only culpable to the people in your municipality, or the only people that vote for you are the people in your state, you have no reason to care if you are a North Carolinian about anyone in California. You have no reason to care about what their interests are. The reason that this model is better is because the federal government has some accountability and some reason to actually care about what goes on there. I think that's a lot of what Bhuwana talks about and what is never responded to in this round. I have two things I'm going to talk about. Tax policy and universality and impacts on citizens. I think we win both these questions. But first of all, let's start off with tax policy and universality. Because First Gov tells you that because of incentives to undercut other states, you get far lower gains from these companies overall. I think this makes sense because of the fact that when you think about it, if states keep trying to undercut each other, there are necessarily going to be lower rates overall. The way that first opposition and second opposition tries to respond to this is by telling you this will happen less because people have an incentive to coordinate. But I don't understand why this incentive actually exists. But what Bhuwana tells you is that these states and local governments actually have an adversarial relationships where companies hold all the power, right? Because if a company asks a small community to lower their tax rate, and the small company frankly can't do it because it needs the tax benefits to be able to run that community, and another community can, you actually have transience of labor where this company moves away. And Bhuwana tells you all the reasons why this transience is actually bad, and it never gets responded to on their side of the house. Very quickly.
So if there are obviously thousands of industries that a community could specialize in. So if there's one that's highly competitive and would cause them to get into a vicious cycle like you talk about with another community, and one that is far less competitive, why would they pick the very adversarial one?
So this idea that there are thousands of different types of industry and you could just specialize in all these different things would be great if this actually was how things worked in reality. But the problem is that many communities are poor and actually can't attract these things in the status quo. If you believed anything that they said, each of these communities would have a different type of industry that made everything magically okay. But the fact is that manufacturing and certain types of industry are necessarily more profitable and have higher gains. They can't just get out of this by creating a false dichotomy where there's a million types of industry where anyone could do it any time and therefore there is no starvation or no poverty. That's ridiculous. But I think more importantly, what we tell you on our side of the house is that we actually gain more aggregate investment on our side of the house for a bunch of reasons that, once again, aren't really responded to. The reason that we get more aggregate investment is because, frankly, companies don't like having to deal with these different restrictions in many different types of the country. Kai responds to this by saying, by misclarifying our argument as corporate law being hard, but that's not what we're trying to say. What we're trying to say is that these companies don't want to be in an untenable situation. Wherein these state and local governments are constantly changing their regulations to meet competitive demand, this in many cases is actually bad because you can't rely on the stability of those places. This is bad for the federal government because attracting business is harder. We never get a response to this argument. This is a theme on side second opposition. First off, tries to tell you then that federal governments are unable to relate or understand local issues like structural unemployment or no infrastructure. What they never realize on their side of the house is that while the federal government might not be a perfect actor in being able to deal with these sorts of things, who is a better actor? The federal government that has to rely on these, at some votes from Iowa, or people from North Dakota who have to not care at all about any of these people. We tell you that insofar as none of these states have any reason to care about these other people, the federal government might not be the perfect actor, but it is certainly a better actor to deal with these states than, for instance, like another state. I don't think that's a reliable mechanism. Lastly, though, they try to tell you that federal governments are unable to deal because of lobbying and also are incentivized to cater to larger states. Two responses once again. Lobbying is much easier when you are targeting smaller communities, and you can actually do this in a scenario where you can reap the most gains from your policy. So this is just a factually untrue argument. But more importantly, we say that it's a more reliable way to help these states is to actually rely on the federal governments who have at least some interest to do that very quickly.
Okay, so one of your extensions is that this is really, like, the companies are all winning because they exploit individuals. Your other extension is that the companies are losing because it's really hard to have tax policy. Can you resolve that tension in your case?
Okay, that's not, so once this is a false tension, like many of the tensions pointed out in debate, I would suggest to you that what we actually talk about in this instance is that, first of all, companies don't come from abroad to begin with because they see the idea that these are not stable policies. That's what we talk about. But when they come into these small communities, they end up monopolizing on, for instance, local governments because they have all the parity of power to be able to have them lower their costs, which I think is incredibly important. Which gets to me my second question on impacts on citizens, and this is what never gets responded to in ideas of transience of labor. Because in a system where you have adversarial states necessarily trying to attract businesses from other parts of the country, something really bad happens. The really bad thing that happens is that a lot of these times these companies start moving around. That is not good for anyone for a bunch of reasons. First reason this is bad is that if you have, for instance, a company like Volvo in my small town that none of you will care about named Goderich, and that is the central place where all of these people work. This is the central place where all of these people live, and that business disappears because someone offers a better incentive in another part of the country. Everyone in that community is disrupted, everyone in that community is harmed, and that is an irrevocable thing to do. On our side of the house, you probably have some transience, but you have far less of it because these states aren't in an adversarial relationship, and federal governments have to account for all of these people. I'd suggest to you that all of the harms of not having a job, of being in a community where you are now lifeless, where you have no ability to have any of these things go on, is a terrible, terrible reality. What Second Op tries to tell you in their extension is that, listen, communities are just going to try and do this in other ways. They're going to try and regulate in different ways, and this is necessarily going to happen. I think it's a pretty consistent stance on side government that we don't think that these localities should have this type of power. Yes, they might find it valuable to themselves, but we think that collective action necessarily leads to more universal gains, and as a stance we are proud to.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and now it's the final speaker from the opposition to conclude the case for the opposition mention in the whole round. shirt match on purpose?
Sorry?
Is that just a happy coincidence?
It's a coincidence.
You always wear friggin' purple.
I
Great.
didn't wear purple tie, but.
Yeah, no, this is a shout out to my buddy Brent. It's changing me bit by bit. Okay. Madam Speaker, I don't really think that we got a great economic case out of government, and I'm going to deal with that in a bit. But I think that the most damning criticism of government as far as reality goes did come from the first opposition team when they pointed out that in reality, the fears that second government had, that corporations will never come from abroad because they're afraid of the weird tax policies, that corporations will never develop stable relationships with communities, they'll never find good deals and stay in those locations, flies in the face of the American reality. Recognize that all of the things that government is worried about, all of the things that they are trying to solve, are things that they've hypothesized and are not true in the America that we see today. I actually don't think that they've actually demonstrated genuine, demonstrable harms. Apart from, and I want to address this quickly, and I'm going to come back to it later, but the problems of corporations that move around, because I concede that it is bad for a city like Goderich to say, you know what, we're not going to give you these preferential policies, and the corporation leaves. But recognize that when you don't allow Goderich to induce that corporation to come to Goderich in the first place, you never get those benefits. I think that Goderich will exist in poverty if it messes with the corporation and the corporation retaliates and leaves. But under government's model, Goderich mires in perpetual poverty, worse than already exists. And I'm sorry, Brent, but actually that's what your policy does. Okay, so I want to talk firstly about whether there are different legitimate conceptions of an optimal tax rate, because opening government absolutely rested their case on that being the case, and I think it's a falsehood. I want to secondly look at this sense of an adversarial system, and then I finally want to look at who breeds the best economic policy on both a local level as well as on a macro level, and I think in particular that's where we succeed. But firstly, not yet. Firstly, opening government said that there is an optimal tax rate, and we want to find the optimal tax rate, and the federal government will find the optimal tax rate. I firstly think that that is a falsity. There is no such thing as an optimal tax rate. There is no such ingredient for making sure that there is economic reality and success for a different area. We heard a concession from second government that perhaps we want to be responsive. We want to have different tax breaks for different corporations, for different resources that exist in different areas. That concession means that you want a specialized tax code that does treat different areas basically different by virtue of what corporations are likely to invest there. Given that that is the case, given that there are legitimate differences, and recognize this is not just about tax breaks, Alberta and British Columbia, I think, have legitimate differences in what the best environmental regulatory policy is. Recognizing that this is the case, that a federal government needs to make that adjudication on their side of the house. But I think that they have the least effective tools to be able to design a responsive policy that, as second government conceded, has local elements and local dimensions to it. I think the conception that we got from first government was completely incorrect, and the example that we got from second government just doesn't take into account. What Kai and I believe is that those differences exist, and instead of penalizing one province over another by choosing the biggest, disproportionately most powerful province and imposing its preferences on the entire country, I think we get a way better, more responsive approach to regulatory policy that, while it is, yes, inefficient in some senses in that it's awkward to deal with, is actually responsive to legitimate differences, to legitimate needs, and to legitimate differences of opinion about what the best way to regulate a corporation is. I actually think you only get that on our side of the house. We believe that these jurisdictions exist for a reason. Those reasons are discussed, they're explained, and we actually solve for them on our side of the house. Opening.
So we're not saying there's some magic social optimum, but don't you agree that it's better to have the same amount of business and more tax revenue, an outcome only possible when you have national regulation rather than states competing to undercut against one another?
So here's the thing. The competition that they talk about still exists. The adversarial relationship between places still exists on their side of the house. What is the difference? Instead of being able to compete in an above-board manner, where you know what the tax rates are between different jurisdictions, the competition instead happens elsewhere. It happens in two different places. Firstly, it happens on the federal lobbying level. Recognize that in this arena, the bigger, more populous, better states
have a massive advantage. All the advantages that they talk about like the resources that you have, the funds that you have, all of those still exist and also make them attractive. The difference is that you set the policies, the differences that I discussed before, in a disproportionate manner to benefit them. And what you don't get is any recourse mechanism for poor areas who are unable to undermine Ontario's hegemony over business in Canada because they just have no recourse mechanism. Parliament doesn't care about Manitoba, and they can no longer say businesses come here because we have a ridiculously lower tax rate than Ontario. They actually have no lobbying power at all, and that's a problem. But they do try to compete anyway, and recognize that by having laxer enforcement of regulations, that by doing weird things with zonings, provinces will still try to outcompete with one another. This drive, this adversarial relationship still exists, but when it exists in this manner, it is far less accountable. You actually no longer know what all of the people do. Because recognize that this analysis about a prisoner's dilemma that they analyzed on their side of the house only works if you are genuinely unsure about all of the information. When you allow the competition to happen in the arena of having differences in taxes, everyone can check them. They can go on the internet and know what the different tax rates are. If the competition happens on the lobbying level, and if it happens on the sneaky, unfortunately corrupt level, you actually have none of that information. The prisoner's dilemma actually occurs on the government side. I think that's a massive problem. But finally, economically, we heard from opening opposition that actually, in practice, you do create these special economic zones, and those do create winners, and that's amazing. I actually think that you do provide a good diversification and specialization. But what we would say is that most importantly of all, there are losers on both sides of the house, and we concede that there are areas that are going to be wealthier, that they're going to be poorer. But what Kai and I provide is a mechanism by which poorer areas can actually rectify or have a plausible manner in which they can rectify their situation. A good macroeconomic policy is one that allows local diversification. And local diversification is best met when you can have a recourse to your poor economic circumstances. On their side of the house, communities that don't have resources, communities that don't have industry, stay that way forever. On our side of the house, they actually have one. They have one difference that they can apply, one difference they can apply between them. They can actually have a way that they can compete with other types of provinces, other areas. We provide that to them, we provide them a chance. I think that this economic liberty alone actually provides better outcomes for people, more likely on our side of the house. For all of these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his speech and everyone for a great debate. If you want to cross the floor, shake hands.
Do we have to hug? Okay.